Fast move the sons of Mim, and fate is heard in the note of the Gjallar horn. Loud blows Heimdall, the horn is aloft. In fear quake all who on hell roads are. Yggdrasil shakes, and shiver on high the ancient limbs, and the giant is loose. To the head of Mim does Odin give heed, but the kinsman of Surt shall slay him soon. How fare the gods, how fare the elves? All Jotunheim groans, the gods are at council. Loud roar the dwarves by the doors of stone, the masters of rocks, would you know yet more? Welcome, everyone, to the Ragnarok episode. Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Smith, and you are listening to The Wayward Wanderer. Of all the stories that survive in Nordic myth, none are more well known or more spectacular than the Doom of the Powers, better known in German as Götterdämmerung, or in the original language, Ragnarok. As far as apocalypses go, there are few that could be described as being so poignant, so bittersweet, so incredibly, unapologetically metal, or as loaded with potential meaning and a rich array of interpretations as the grand struggle that runs through Nordic myth. It brings all of the biggest players, or at least most of them, for one grand final confrontation where the scores left unsettled and unresolved between Aesir and the Jotnar they have battled with over the long years are finally settled, to the misery and ruin of all. And when I'm saying dramatic, cosmic, really absolutely metal, and other terms like that, I'm not exaggerating by much. Ragnarok has all kinds of incredible imagery of a world tree holding up 9 worlds, bursting into an all-consuming inferno, where mighty beings clash in epic, earth-shaking confrontations. Odin faces Fenrir, the great wolf, and is devoured in a single bite. His son Thor wrestles with the mighty Midgard serpent in a clash that shakes reality before both succumb to mutual destruction. An army of the dead ferried across reality, made from the fingernails and toenails of the dishonored dead, with a vengeful Loki at the helm. It really has got it all. When it comes to apocalypses, there's few that really manage to tick all the boxes of cosmic struggle, earth-shaking stakes, zombies, and all the other things that you really need if you want to just completely blow the lid off reality, like Ragnarok. And yet, for all the drama and majesty that comes with this myth, there is a certain, as I said, sort of bittersweet, melancholy, almost regretful air to the whole thing, even though the stakes are universal in scope, and the sides seemingly diametrically opposed. Ragnarok, within the fullness of the Nordic myth, takes on a deeper meaning. One almost gets the sense that this could have been avoided. And the fact that this truly is how it all must end. How all the conflicts and turmoil between these different groups of gods, as well as on Midgard, must be resolved. Far from being a celebration of what unfolds, like, say, the Book of Revelations, Ragnarok feels almost like a terrible tragedy, a train wreck of unimaginable proportions, hammered home by the Cirrus's constant refrain in the Voluspa of, "Would you know yet more?" In some ways, I'm a bit slack in having taken this long to get to this topic because of how important it is, how central it is to the whole mythic cycle, as well as, let's be honest, how critical it is in my own particular interpretation of heathen practice, as is described more in the way of Fire and Ice, as well as because of other debates and other parallels that have been drawn by other folks, like, for example, Rune Rasmussen over at the Nordic Animism channel, between what is described in the Voluspa of the stark warning delivered by a nameless Cirrus pulled forth from the grave mound using forbidden magics to compel her to speak, and the climate crisis we face today. There's also quite a bit of debate about how much or little Ragnarok is truly a part of the Nordic mythos. So I'll be wrestling with a lot of that and quite a bit more as we go ahead. Before we dive in, I want to give a special thank you to all of my patrons who are basically paying the bills that are keeping this podcast on the air and are helping for me to do more of this work of building inclusive heathen practice. So if you like this episode, if you like my writing or any other stuff, think about heading on over to my Patreon at patreon.com/waywardwanderer. $5 a month gets you all the perks and more. And if you are also interested in finding out more or even learning more, the Fire and Ice Teaching Collective, including myself, offer classes which are available at onblackwings.com in Fire and Ice heathenry, modern Nordic mysticism, and more. So if you like what you're hearing, if you want to see more inclusive, relevant, and modern heathenry, then consider contributing or checking things out at On Black Wings. So, shameless plug out of the way, I'm going to get started first by describing a bigger concept called cyclical cosmology and drawing some parallels between what we see in the Nordic myth and other myths from around the world. I will then get into another apocalypse that may be very familiar to a lot of folks living in, like, say, any part of the world where heathenry tends to be popular, and the Book of Revelations, which is easily the most well-known apocalypse in the modern world. Though, as you'll see, there's some significant differences between Ragnarok and what's in Revelations. Next, I'll get a bit more into some explanations about where Ragnarok comes from, because there is quite a bit of debate as to how it makes its way into the myth. What it means for modern heathens, particularly around subjects like, say, the climate crisis. And then I'll just sort of wrap things up on some final thoughts. The best starting point is the concept of cyclical cosmology. This refers to a model of reality that assumes everything moves in larger cyclical patterns. That life, the universe, and everything is not simply a linear progression from point A to point B, but that everything moves in certain repeatable, discernible patterns that have some consistent tendencies and outcomes, which, in the broad strokes, can be predicted to some extent. Working from first principles, the logic behind cyclical cosmology is really pretty straightforward, especially if you're looking at things from an animistic perspective, where spirituality is often a reflection and an extension of our relationships with the world around us. The natural world, in every part of the world in some way or another, follows clear seasonal patterns, where generally speaking, there are parts of the year where there's a greater degree of fertility and bounty in different parts of the world, and other periods of reduced activity, reduced possibility, and a withdrawal from the more productive kind of energy-intensive labor that's necessary to really survive and make a living. Now, this is not always the same, and in modern paganism, a lot is made of a consistent wheel of the year that describes winter, spring, summer, and fall, a set of seasons that are very particular to England, the northeastern United States, and other areas of Europe and North America that are in a similar climactic band. Now, that said, this doesn't mean seasons don't happen, they just don't always necessarily follow this pattern. Egypt, for example, marked their calendar based on the flooding of the Nile River, where they distinguished between the dry parts of the year, the flooding parts of the year, and the parts in between where the waters receded enough for agricultural work to be done. In California, where I've grown up and have spent most of my life and currently live, we also, in practice, effectively have a 3-season model of wet, dry, and fire. There are also other similar, easily discernible cycles, especially if you are living, say, in early Iron Age or late Iron Age Scandinavia, where during the winter you have extensive snow and ice and all that good stuff, and then as things warm up, coming into spring and then the long summer, the water and snow melts, rivers and lakes run free, and now everything is moving very differently and also much more bountifully until you get to the summer where, by the way, the length of day and night, which is something I've talked about quite a bit before on this podcast, starts swinging very dramatically in the direction of long, bright days, in contrast to cold, very dark nights that preceded it. The worlds of Nordic myth follow a similar kind of cyclical pattern of moving from one form that is beneficial to one particular form to another form that are beneficial to other forms of existence. The first form that existed for reality was of fire, ice, and the great void that lay between. At some point in the distant past, fire and ice collided in the Gununga Gap, the great void of nothingness, which gave rise to Ymir, the cow Odumla, and the tundra on which they lived. This new form of reality then persisted until Odin, Vili, and Ve, who were born grandchildren of the shining being Buri, who was licked free from the ice by Odumla's foraging, overthrow Ymir, slay the great giant, and use the parts of their body to craft Midgard as we know it. During this time, they also craft Asgard, the dwarves first come into existence, and generally this seems to be when the Nine Worlds, as we know it, comes into being. Following this age, at its utter end, is Ragnarok, where the enemies of the gods who have been accumulated over long years, some of which by the actions of the gods, thus making the vengeance taken by beings like Fenrir somewhat justified, at least within the Nordic context of justice and vengeance. After Ragnarok, a green world emerges. The slain Aesir Balder comes back from the dead. The children of Thor take up Thor's hammer. The two surviving humans give rise to a new beginning for their species, and reality begins again, with some elements, like Nidhogg from the old, still present. In short, a new world comes into existence by a systemic disruption of the old. Out of cataclysm, new beings emerge that shape this world to their greatest benefit. The contradictions of these realities reach a breaking point. Elements in conflict with the status quo rise into battle, and from the chaos and cataclysm that follows, a new reality is made possible. This, by the way, is something that I call out as being something of a dialectical process, which means the cycle follows a pattern of logic defined by the conflict between thesis and antithesis, essentially that which exists and that which is challenging that which currently exists, and from the conflict, as well as confluence and combination of thesis and antithesis, a new synthesis, which is born of the resolution of the contradiction between thesis and antithesis, will come into existence. And this synthesis becomes the thesis of the future. This process has no end. It simply continues in all its forms. There are no implications within the Nordic myth that the green world is a paradise that will end all things. It simply is the next step in a long chain of events, stretching all the way back to an unknowable and primordial past. This is also not that unusual of a concept in myth. You don't have to look very far, just over to, say, Ireland or the Hellenic Mediterranean, where the Greeks had the greatest cultural influence, to find some similar myths that bear similar patterns. In the Book of Invasions, which describes the coming of the Tuatha Dé Danann and eventually the first humans to Ireland, there is a similar pattern of several different groups of beings who had lived and come into Ireland, come into conflict with those who were already present, and then reached some kind of resolution. Some of those resolutions were a bit genocidal, but that's ultimately sort of the process that happens, with the Tuatha Dé Danann coming into conflict when they arrive with the existing Fair Bolg, who themselves are previous migrants who reached an accommodation with the Fomorians, who are said to dwell beneath the sea and hold power over the island. Eventually, the Milesians, who are the progenitors, according to legend, of the Irish Gaels, arrive. They hold beyond the ninth wave, and then come into conflict with the Tuatha Dé Danann before finally reaching an accommodation that allows the Milesians and the Tuatha Dé Danann to live side by side within Ireland, at least in some sense of the word. Hellenic myth has a similar pattern of beings known as the primordials, who first created reality as we know it, who are eventually overthrown by their children, who are known as the Titans, who include beings like Gaia, Cronus, and many other figures that may be familiar to some listeners. Cronus is then overthrown by Zeus and his brothers and sisters, the first of the Olympians, who create the first humans and give rise to the world as we know it today. It is also said, in some sources anyway, that one day Zeus will be overthrown by one of his own sons, much the same way as he overthrew his father Cronus. Though in this case, unlike, say, the Book of Invasions, or more graphically, the Voluspa, there is nothing that specifically says what this ultimate conflict will look like or what it means for the Olympians. Only that there is a certainty that eventually this dynamic will repeat itself, because it's already happened twice before within this understanding of the cosmos. You also find, interestingly enough, a similar pattern with a group of people who are completely unconnected to the various more European-based myths that I've discussed. And what we're going to do for a moment is hop across the Atlantic over the Mexica people, whose descendants included the Aztec and many other groups that are indigenous to what is now modern-day Mexico. In this body of myth, the current reality as we know it is the fifth sun to come into existence, with 4 previous suns having been created by the gods and, in different ways, defined other ages and other forms of creation. Each of these times existed under their own unique conditions, with humanity not even coming onto the scene until the second sun was made. And each epoch would end with conflict between the gods over how reality was functioning and disagreements over the best way to order existence. This fifth sun, which is reality as we know it, was prophesied as to end in earthquakes, with the implication that a sixth sun and another age of existence would follow. The point of all this cross-mythic comparison is that this idea of reality not being in a fixed form and following its own seasons of a sort, in the same way as the earth we live in follows a seasonal cycle, is an understandable perspective for animistic, polytheistic cultures and myths to arrive at. This, I think, is important to establish before I go into the much more well-known beats and contours of Revelations. Now, Revelations, in a lot of ways, has culturally strongly imprinted itself on modern society in terms of how we imagine things like apocalypse and the end of the world. And oh boy, is it definite when we're talking Revelations. Unlike Ragnarok, or any of these other mythic apocalypses that I've described, where the end of one world is the beginning of another, Revelations is it. It is the final battle and final judgment between the forces of God and the enemies of God. I also want to stress enemies of God, by the way, because the history of how Revelations has been interpreted, how things like the devil and the Antichrist are understood, and lots of other factors have changed and moved over time. So I'm talking very much in broad strokes here when I'm talking about what is definite in Revelations, because there are some elements, like, for example, the rapture, that are actually much more recent additions to the body of Christian myth, and aren't even universally accepted by most denominations. Regardless of the particulars, Revelations is the definite end. It finishes with final judgment, and judgment being rendered on the enemies of God, while the righteous are rewarded for their faith. It is, in some ways, like Ragnarok, a final settling of accounts. But how these accounts are being settled is very different from how it happens in Ragnarok. Ragnarok, to put it directly, is a culmination of many long-standing grudges, unresolved grievances and conflicts between the different characters of Nordic myth. Within the context of Nordic ethics around justice, vengeance, and who is and isn't allowed to exact these things, many of the figures who are coming into conflict with the Aesir are fully justified, to some extent or another, in taking their revenge. Whether this is Loki, very understandably unleashing an army of the dead, both probably because Loki went, well, this apocalypse needs zombies, and also because Loki had been thrown into a cave with a snake to have venom drip on their face for the rest of forever, in punishment for calling out and exposing the foibles of the gods, as well as the harms they did to Loki's own children. Fenrir and Jormungandr have long-standing business with Odin and Thor that has not been resolved. As for Surt, there is old bad blood between the Aesir and the Jotnar, particularly the Jotnar of Muspelheim, that goes back to the downfall of Ymir, as well as many other instances that have happened between that moment and the final battle of the ultimate war. The Aesir, similarly, are, from their perspective, defending themselves from these forces who are coming to exact harm and retribution upon them. There isn't really a clear-cut good and evil here, and arguably, because we know within the myth that the gods of all these different groups of Aesir, Vanir, and Jotnar do have shared customs around things like weregild, hospitality, and resolution of grievances, that implies, maybe this could have been avoided. Maybe these conflicts could have been resolved in a different way. In fact, some of them were. This is very different from Revelations, where there is a clear-cut good and evil, and what defines it is whether or not you are on the side of God. Those who stand with God and with Jesus, who comes back carrying a sword to lay waste to the enemies of the righteous, are those who will be saved and counted among the elect, while those who oppose this will be damned and cast into a lake of fire, including the mysterious beast and their false prophet, which is where the character of the Antichrist sort of comes from. This difference even pervades the text of how both of these myths are presented. Ragnarok is foreboding and mournful, where the Cirrus's repeated refrain of, "Would you know yet more?" punctuates and drives each new development, leaving the impression that Odin may in fact be trapped to hear all of what is to come, even though there is little he can do to stop it. Revelations, by contrast, is celebratory and triumphal. It is the exaltation of ultimate victory and the celebration of the righteous being rewarded and the damned being punished. Nothing better emphasizes this than the sharp contrast between the following passages and the Voluspa, which could be the closest you could say there is to an upbeat moment in this poem prior to the green world after Ragnarok, which reads as follows: "Now comes Hlin, yet another hurt, when Odin fares to fight with the wolf, and Beli's fair slayer seeks out Surt, for there must fall the joy of Frigg. Then comes Sigfather's mighty son, Vidar, to fight with the foaming wolf, and the giant's son does he thrust his sword, full to the heart, his father avenged." In contrast to a much more gleeful section from Revelations, which begins chapter 19, verse 17 to verse 21. King James translation. "And I saw an angel standing in the sun,
And he cried with a loud voice, saying to all the fowls that fly in the midst of heaven, Come and gather yourselves together unto the supper of the great God, that ye may eat the flesh of kings, and the flesh of captains, and the flesh of mighty men, and the flesh of horses, and both them that sit on them, and the flesh of all men, both free and bond, both great and small. And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies gathered together to make war against him that sat on the horse, and against his army. And the beast was taken, and with him the false prophet that wrought miracles before him, with which he deceived them that had received the mark of the beast, and them that worshipped his image. These both were cast alive into a lake of fire burning with brimstone. And the remnant were slain with the sword of him that sat upon the horse, which sword proceeded out of his mouth, and all the fowls were filled with their flesh.
Another critical difference between these different myths is the dynamic at the heart of these stories. Ragnarok is a result of escalating conflict that is, in its own way, a manifestation of a greater cycle within Weird that even gods and worlds cannot escape. Whereas Revelations is about the challenging of power, and power asserting its final victory over its enemies. Or, depending on how you see it, the final victory for the righteous and persecuted against their oppressors. Either way, one is a question of clear triumph of good over evil. The other is a tragic, glorious catastrophe that is the accumulation of long-standing, unresolved grievances. This, then logically, I think, brings us to the question of where does Ragnarok come from? And whether or not it's even something that should be a valid part of heathen practice. Something that may surprise a lot of listeners is there have long been arguments within the heathen community, as well as to an extent among historians, as to whether Ragnarok is truly a product of the Nordic peoples and their understanding of the world, or is something influenced by other outside forces, and to what extent this is true. Two particular theories I'd like to get into are Neil Price's theory of a pre-existing cataclysm, which I think has a bit of validity to it, as well as the argument of Christian influence upon Nordic myth. Neil Price's theory, which is outlined in Children of Ash and Elm, is that Ragnarok is, to an extent, a cultural memory of a cataclysm which unfolded across the world during the mid-500s, when a major volcanic eruption caused a slight dimming of the sun. And this is something that is attested to in geological data, in tree rings, as well as in surviving source materials from several different parts of the world that describe, for example, in Byzantine histories from the Eastern Roman Empire, a dimming of the sun that preceded the coming of a great plague, both of which are things that seem to have happened, as well as other similar descriptions from India, China, the Middle East, and several other parts of the world. The prevailing theory is that a major volcanic eruption, probably of similar scale to Krakatoa or Santorini, caused the atmosphere to be dimmed by a significant increase in dust and particles in the air, which caused things like crop failures, colder weather, darker, colder days, and all kinds of other things that, particularly when you get into the less arable and more marginal lands that the Nordic peoples inhabited, would have spelt widespread societal breakdown and devastation. While, as I have established, the idea of a cyclical cosmology is not original to the Nordic peoples, this particular wrinkle may help explain why the ending is both so cataclysmic and vividly described. The question of Christian influence is one that is a bit more contested, where on one side it is argued that it was interplay with the different Christian groups that the Nordic peoples were trading and in conflict conflict with that gave rise to this particular myth, with some even arguing it was wholesale duplicated from the Book of Revelations. Now, I think this is something that is not an entirely fair read of things, both because, as we've already established, there's very significant differences between what is depicted in the Voluspo versus what is in Revelations, but also because there are other sources that refer to Ragnarok in some way or another. We have multiple references in the Vafthrûnismál, which is the saga where Odin goes and riddles with the giant Vafthrûnir to demonstrate who is the wiser of these two beings. During this context, Vafthrûnir, as well as Odin in disguise, describe details of how the present world was created, what came before, and also that eventually there will be another world after Ragnarok. There is also reference in the Volsunga saga, specifically the Fafnismál, to Sigurd interrogating Fafnir for information and learning, among other things, the name of the plane where Surt and Freyr will shed the water of swords, which is a very nice poetic way of describing bloodshed. An incident that is specifically a key moment in Ragnarok. There is also, to refer back to the earlier pattern of cyclical cosmologies emerging in several other cultures, the explanation that, as a polytheistic and animistic culture, the Nordic peoples viewing things in a more cyclical way makes a certain amount of sense. Now, that said, this is not to say there is not potential Christian influence on the particular contours of the Voluspa. I think you could make an argument that the specific shape and details of the Voluspa and Ragnarok may have not truly given form until the conflict and clash between Christian and non-Christian groups in Nordic Scandinavia was coming to a head, at which point it would make a certain amount of sense for followers of the old ways to begin to more vividly imagine what this ultimate end would look like and what would bring it about. Possibly as something to rally those who still stood on their side, perhaps to offer an explanation that in some way these ways will survive, or that our practices still hold power, or any number of other explanations. But I think that broadly speaking, though it's likely there was particular Christian influence that hastened and sharpened the particulars of Ragnarok, the deeper pattern was one that was already there. And while the details may not have been fully determined by the time the Voluspa was composed and then eventually written down, the idea seems at least to have some deeper validity within the surviving source material. So what does this mean for anyone who's interested in modern Nordic spirituality? A more superficial take would say, well, what's the point? Your gods are going to die eventually anyway, so why bother with them? But I think, this is a bit of a superficial take that ignores the deeper significance and meaning behind this whole view of reality. This is because, as I see it, there are three distinct things that give very strong takeaways and powerful examples for anyone who is looking to this body of myth for guidance and inspiration. These are discussing Ragnarok as a warning, describing what it was that brought about Midgard in the first place, and the broader pattern that exists. Now, first and foremost, Ragnarok as a warning, I think, is something that needs to be picked at a bit more. This is something that clearly exists in the framing of the poem, where it begins with Odin summoning the nameless Sirius to answer his questions about what it is that lies ahead, what awaits him, and what's going to happen. Given the dark tidings that she relates, as well as the clear implications that she is not giving this information voluntarily and has been compelled to provide it, Odin may already, at least in my interpretation, at least strongly suspect that everything is starting to go at least a little bit off the rails. Now, more broadly, if you view Ragnarok as the culmination of all these different feuds and conflicts, which I think is a very valid interpretation, then it stands as a warning, particularly to an ethos where personal autonomy and the right to vengeance are things that are prized, of what can happen when these things really get out of hand, of how these kind of conflicts can escalate. And they do parallel with the similar dynamic of near total destruction that happens in the Volsunga saga. In this way, Ragnarok can be seen as something of a warning there. But there is one particular verse from the Voluspa that truly hammers this home. Many tellings of this myth begin with Fimbulwinter, a winter that lasts for 3 seasons. But this is only the first event in the progression of Ragnarok in Snorri's retelling of it. To return to the Voluspa for a moment.
On a hill there sat, and smote on his harp, Egg-Tether the Joyous, the giant's warder. Above him the cock in the birdwood crowed, fair and red did Fjalar stand. Then to the gods crowed Golan-Kombi. He wakes the heroes in Odin's hall, and beneath the earth does another crow, the rust-red bird at the bars of hell. Now Garm howls loud before Nipaheliir. The fetters will burst and the wolf run free. Much do I know and more can see of the fate of the gods, the mighty in fight. Brothers shall fight and fell each other, and sisters' sons shall kinship stain. Hard it is on earth with mighty abandon. Axe time, sword time, shields are sundered. Wind time, wolf time, ere the world falls, nor ever shall men each other spare.
In short, 3 roosters, one by the giants, one by the Aesir, and one before the gates of the halls of the dead, sound their alarms, and shortly after, humanity proceeds to destroy itself in a war of all against all. It is not clear if the crowing of the 3 roosters is the cause or simply a portent of things to come. What is certain is in the Voluspa, the first stone to fall is one that is thrown by humanity. This gives strong emphasis to this broader dynamic of different gods coming into conflict based on long-standing grievances and unresolved strife. What is happening in the cosmos, on the fields of Idavol, is preceded, echoed, and prefigured by a similar total breakdown of all social bonds and kinship. In this way, Ragnarok can be seen as a warning of what unresolved grievance and harm can do if left to fester. The later references to the Yggdrasil and all upon it bursting into flame, being burnt to a cinder by the coming end, carries even greater significance, I think, in a time when vast forest fires have begun wiping out the trees that hold up the biosphere and make life possible, of a world where conflict and confrontation becomes increasingly likely as climate change and its attendant disasters reduce what is available to all of us, whether that is land, food, clean water, or safety. The tumult of climate change seems to eerily prefigure that which will drive Ragnarok into being. However, there is also another way to look at this, and that requires going back to the beginning of the cycle, of the creation of Midgard from Ymir, who, it must be said, was the only being that could sup from the milk of the great cow Odumla, and all others were forced to make a living foraging from the barren tundra that characterized the time of Ymir. It was in this environment that Odin and his brothers rose up to overthrow Ymir and make a new, more fertile, and more abundant world. Now, this side of the myth is important because if we're talking about cycles, and if we're saying to an extent the grievances of those who are fighting the Aesir are justified, then perhaps there are some circumstances where it is appropriate to be rising against the present order to replace it with a new one. After all, it's how the Aesir made reality as we know it possible. And perhaps in a time of climate change where, like a slumbering giant, certain elements of our political economic system have almost unconsciously, as if in a slumber, supped disproportionately from the proceeds of the exploitation of the Earth's natural resources and all that live upon it, then perhaps the way out requires overthrowing our own slumbering giants. Ragnarok and the logic surrounding it also urges us to consider the ways that the world changes and moves, that sometimes it's through conflict and the resolution of conflict and contradiction that brings about necessary change. And this dynamic, whether we'd like it or not, will always be unfolding. And as much as we would like to cling to a notion of there being fixed, immovable points in the world, that in fact we have to address that everything is always in motion. And what it is that gives us support is always growing and changing and reshaping itself, as are we, as everything works through the conflict and tensions, as well as contradictions, that are just facts of life. Ragnarok reminds us that all things, even gods and realities, will someday face an ending. And from that ending, new beginnings will arise, with this pattern continuing ever onward to unknown, though interesting and surprising ends. No matter how it is you interpret or view Ragnarok, it is a crucial myth for understanding the Nordic cosmos, a grand cosmic drama of triumph, tragedy, and earth-shaking proportions. A tale that, quite frankly, is well overdue for a top-shelf metal opera, perhaps with a little refrain of a mournful violin overlaid in the final moments before all bursts into flame. There is much to learn from it and to wrestle with. But regardless, it is a critical component of Nordic myth and modern heathen spirituality, with layers of rich and powerful meaning. And that is the long and short of I hope you have enjoyed this episode. is Ryan Smith at The Wayward Wanderer, signing off. If you enjoyed this podcast and want to help support more work like this, then please head on over to patreon.com/waywardwanderer. $5 a month gets you early access to podcast episodes, ad-free listening, monthly patrons-only live stream sessions with your host and author of The Way of Fire and Ice, Ryan Smith, and more. Please head on over to patreon.com/waywardwanderer. Thanks for listening.